class, we're going to begin week 5 with the concept of legal. We're going to talk about scope of practice and accountability. I really want to encourage you to watch the YouTube video that was assigned to you before coming to class. It's a really uplifting video. It talks about our scope of practice, and it shows many people who are involved in healthcare as registered nurses or students that finish the phrase, "I believe working to the full scope of practice as a registered nurse means." And some of the responses are just so wonderful, things that we've already talked about. And I'm sure after you get done reading about this particular concept and going through the activities that I'm going to go over with you, you'll have your own idea as to what it means to you to work in your full scope of practice. We have such a huge responsibility to our patients. And as you can see right now with what's going on in the world, nurses are even more respected and admired than ever before because we are the ones on the front line now with all these patients that unfortunately have acquired the COVID-19 disease. So I just wanted to point that out. Just watch it. It's such a nice video, and it really gives us a wide perspective of all the many things that we do within our scope of practice as registered nurses. All right. So what I want to do now is just kind of go over some of the important points that are in your reading. All right, because I think legal is one of those concepts where we really don't think much about it until we come across the experience. And we kind of do things that we don't realize that really are a legal action to prevent ourselves from, being involved in some kind of legalities. And also it's a way that we follow policies and procedures and legal matters to protect our patients as well. So what I first wanted to kind of just go over was many of the treatments or diagnostic studies that we see ordered for our patients really do, involve informed consent. And what does that mean when we talk about informed consent? It refers to the patient's legal and ethical rights to be informed of or to give or refuse permission for any kind of procedure or any kind of treatment that the doctor orders. But before a patient signs a permit, it's really important that they're giving all the information about that particular procedure or diagnostic study so that they're aware that maybe there are risks involved with that particular procedure, and that needs to be conveyed to the patient as well as to the patient's family. And then they should be making the decision as to whether or not to go ahead and do that. Remember, this is all about patient-centered care, and the patient should have all that knowledge so they can make the final decision and not leave it up entirely to their healthcare provider. And the healthcare provider really has a ethical duty to make sure that he's telling the patient all about the procedure and really telling it to them and to the family in a language that the patient is going to definitely understand. He should also include, or she should also include, available alternatives. Also, really being very honest about the risk and the benefits of each treatment. And after hearing all that, and the patient and their families talking it over, the patient does have ultimately the right to refuse having that particular procedure or treatment done. There are general guidelines regarding the information that should be provided to the patient. The diagnosis or condition that requires treatment, the purpose of the treatment, what the patient can expect, explaining about the treatment. Is there a particular prep involved? What's going to happen before and during the procedure? Is it going to be painful? Are they going to receive medication? What's the benefit of doing this particular treatment or procedure? And what are the possible risks that are involved with that patient, with that particular treatment? And what are the advantages and disadvantages of possible alternatives? And the patient obviously should not be coaxed or coerced by anybody involved. And we really want to be sure that before they make their final decision. Sorry about the dogs barking. But again, going back to what we were talking about, after the explanations are provided to the patient, it's necessary that you get a feel whether or not your patients do understand what you just told them or what the doctor just told them about the procedures, the treatments, so that, when he or she provides that informed consent, that it is truly what their wishes are, okay? So that's just important to know about. We don't realize that throughout the day in which we care for our patients, they do provide us informed consent, and that can either be expressed or implied. Expressed is when it's an oral or written agreement, and implied means we can kind of tell by their body language that they are accepting of what you're going to do for them as the nurse. And what do I mean by that? If you come in and you want to do a blood pressure on your patient, the patient may get into a position or extend out their arm, which tells you that they give you permission to take their blood pressure, okay? Or if you're coming in to give an injection, the patient, may lay on their side or lift up their gown if you're giving a subcutaneous injection in the abdomen. So these are ways that the patient expresses to you that they give their full consent in whatever you want to do for them. The term competency for consent refers to the legal presumption applied to an individual when they become an adult. And competency gives an adult the right to negotiate those certain legal activities, such as, making a will out or also entering into some kind of contract. And usually an adult is considered to be competent at 18 years of age, unless there's something that proves that they're not competent as an adult at that particular age. So if an individual at 18 years or older is declared legally incompetent, then they should be provided a legal guardian to help make those decisions and to sign those informed consents as well. Sometimes we find patients who are rendered temporarily incompetent because maybe they've just had some kind of sedation from a narcotic, or maybe they've had a serious injury which caused them to not be performing as competently as they should, that there's some neurodeficit there. And sometimes as nurses we can kind of tell and kind of feel when a patient really isn't competent to make that decision. And so if you do have concern about a patient's level of competency, you should really talk this over with the physician, okay? And if the doctor determines that the patient is not competent by not being able to provide an informed consent, the provider will also determine whether the emergency doctrine applies. And that would be in case of an emergency that they have to kind of step in and do something immediately to save the person's life. And it's really important that all healthcare people especially us nurses who are around our patients all the time, should be familiar with the state laws and the policies and procedures of their employing government that kind of entail what we should do with patients who may not be competent or who are unable to give us legal and informed consent. There is a little paragraph about consent in an emergency. It just talks about how in most states the law assumes an individual's consent to medical treatment when the individual is in an imminent danger of loss of life or a limb, or he or she is unable to give informed consent. So basically what this means is there's this emergency doctrine in place that assumes that an individual would reasonably consent to treatment if he was able to do so. So the healthcare provider, whoever is in charge, is able to provide that care to the person. And then we have to think about a child when it comes to healthcare decisions. Obviously, for a minor child, a parent or guardian must give informed consent for medical treatments. And there are certain exceptions that do exist. So be sure you read about those. Those include situations in which the emergency doctrine applies when the child is an emancipated minor. And that means that they're absolutely under no control of the parents. And he or she actually manages their own financial affairs as well. There's a box 49.2 that's on page 2835 in your book. And it talks about the overview of minor consent laws when it deals with contraceptive services. 21 states and the District of Columbia allow all minors age 12 years and older to consent to contraceptive services, and 25 states allow only certain categories of minors to consent to contraceptive services. So it's important to know how Ohio sees that particular service in regards to minors. Sexually transmitted infection services. This is very important, as we just talked about STIs a couple weeks ago. All states and the District of Columbia allow all minors to consent to services for sexually transmitted infections. When it comes to prenatal care, 32 states and the District of Columbia explicitly allow all minors to consent to prenatal care. It talks about adoption. 28 states and the District of Columbia allow all minor parents to choose to place their child for adoption. And then medical care for a child. 30 states and the District of Columbia allow all minor parents to consent to medical care for their child. The remaining 20 states have no relevant explicit policy or case law. And then the next one is obviously a very controversial subject of abortion. 2 states and the District of Columbia explicitly allow all minors to consent to abortion services. 21 states require that at least one parent consent to a minor's abortion, while 13 states require prior notification of at least one parent. State laws regarding abortion may change. Be sure to know the laws in your state. So these are just some topics that come up as we care for our patients, and to know that with these particular situations, there are laws that protect the individual. And it's important that if we come across these situations, we need to know what our particular state says about that situation the patient is going through. The next thing I want to talk about is scope of practice and the Nurse Practice Act. Okay, you might see that written as NPA. What is the Nurse Practice Act? A Nurse Practice Act is a series of state statutes that define the scope of practice, are standards for education programs, licensure requirements, and grounds for disciplinary action. And it is also the law that provides a framework for establishing nursing actions in the care of our patients that we care for, okay? And laws are set the boundaries for and maintain a standard of nursing practice. And so we as nurses are definitely held accountable to these specific standards for licensure and grounds for revocation in the state of employment. And for us as registered nurses, the provisions of the Nurse Practice Acts are quite similar from state to state. There's a greater variation that exists in the scope of practice for the licensed practical nurse and the licensed vocational nurse. And how are these Nurse Practice Acts enforced and administered? Well, they are enforced and administered by the State Board of Nursing. And our State Board of Nursing is down in Columbus, all right? And these Board of Nursing organizations were established some 100 years ago to standardize the education of nurses, establish standards for safe nursing practice, and issue license to protect the public from unprepared and unsafe practitioners. The Board of Nursing is a very powerful organization, and I will say this, they are the ones that have the power over our nursing program. If they don't like what's being done, or if people complain or write a letter about something that happened within our program and they go to investigate it and they found out that we as a nursing program have done anything seriously wrong or not followed proper policies regarding anything in our nursing program, then they have the authority to close down our program. That's why they're very, very concerned when they look at our NCLEX scores, because as I said many times, and I've told you this in person, that it's necessary that our students are achieving at least 95% of the national average. And when we are not achieving that, they will look at why is that particular nursing program showing very poor NCLEX results. And their philosophy, the bottom line is, they are here to protect the public. So obviously, if we're putting out nurses who have very low NCLEX scores, then that's very concerning to them. And we want to be able to provide the community with safe practitioners when they graduate, and in order to evaluate that type of practice or that type of learning, we go by the results of the NCLEX. So the Board of Nursing is a very, very powerful organization, okay? And the state's Nurse Practice Act dictate the membership of the state's Board of Nursing. And usually that Board of Nursing, there's a mixture of disciplines on that Board of Nursing. You may have RNs, you may have LPNs, you may have advanced practice nurses, and even consumers. And the members of the Board of Nursing are appointed according to the regulation in each state, with the exception of North Carolina. Remember that North Carolina is the only state in which licensed nurses serving on the board are elected by other licensed nurses, and members of the public who serve are appointed. Now, over the years, the Board of Nursing have expanded their function to include activities such as programs for impaired nurses, remediation of practice issues, and participation in multi-state licensure compacts. And as I said before, their mission is to protect the public. And they also serve as a forum for citizen complaints about nursing services and actually against individual nurses. Now, they receive complaints every day, and I will tell you honestly that as a member of the Board of Nursing, they look at every complaint that is sent to them, and they investigate it thoroughly to determine if that particular school or individual is definitely at fault, because, as I said, they want to be sure that the community is protected. So I think that's really quite admirable, because obviously as registered nurses, we also want to be sure that safe nurses are out there taking care of the patients in our community. All right, let's talk a little bit about licensure. We all know that after we graduate from a nursing program, we are given the privilege of being able to take an NCLEX or a test which evaluates our learning and confirms that we are safe practitioners and can go about and practice within our scope of practice. And when you pass the NCLEX and you receive a licensure to practice professional nursing, it does allow us as nurses the legal privilege to practice nursing as defined in your state's Nurse Practice Acts. And through the process of licensure, the Board of Nursing ensures the provisions of safe nursing care to the public. And your Board of Nursing oversees licensure through the following activities. They establish and monitor educational standards for nursing education programs. So they're looking at our program all the time. They define professional standards. They examine and renew the licenses of duly qualified applicants. They investigate any violation of the Nurse Practice Acts. They sanction to the point of initiating prosecution against those who violate the Nurse Practice Acts, and they hold disciplinary hearings for possible suspensions or revocation of their licensure. And they establish and oversee diversity programs in some states. And the focus on diversity and culture feature looks at efforts to increase diversity in the nursing workforce. And each Board of Nursing will oversee the administration of a licensure examination that measures the competencies needed to perform safely and effectively as a newly licensed entry-level nurse. Now remember, as associate degree nursing students who graduate from an associate degree program such as ours, you will take the same NCLEX as a student who graduates from a diploma school or from a four-year program, okay? So the National Council of State Board of Nursing has developed 2 licensure exams. One is for the registered nurse, and as I said, you'll all take the same one. It'll be the NCLEX for RNs, and then there's a National Council licensure examination for practical nurses, and that's an NCLEX for the PN programs. And it's for state and territory Board of Nursing to implement as part of their requirements for licensure. And there's also, under the Board of Nursing, there's also a National Nurse Aid Assessment Program and the Medication Aid Certification examination as well. And your licenses are definitely issued by your state in which you want to practice your profession in. And to maintain the privilege to practice afforded by the license, the individual nurse is required to demonstrate awareness and application of standards of nursing care and meet his or her responsibilities to both the patients and to the healthcare system. And the board is also responsible for taking action against nurses who have exhibited unsafe nursing practices or who are otherwise engaged in professional misconduct or will fail to meet requirements for licensure renewal. And The Board of Nursing details what charges of professional misconduct may result in a revocation or suspension of a nurse's license. And that would be giving false information or withholding material information from the board in procuring or attempting to procure a license to practice nursing, or being convicted of or pleading either guilty or nolo contendere to any crime that indicates the nurse is unfit or incompetent to practice or has deceived or defrauded the public. And in pleading a nolo contendere, the individual neither admits nor denies that he or she has committed the crime, but agrees to a punishment. Usually it's either a fine or actual jail time, as if guilty. Usually the reason someone will enter this type of plea is because it cannot be used as an admission of guilt if a civil lawsuit is initiated following the conclusion of a criminal trial. It will engage in conduct that endangers the public health, and anybody who's being unfit or incompetent to practice by reason of deliberate or negligence or admissions, regardless of whether actual injury to the patient has been committed or established, and engaging in conduct that deceives, defrauds, or harms the public in the course of professional activities or services. And we talk about the National Council of State Boards of Nursing, and that provides leadership to advance regulatory excellence for public protection. And the membership of the National Council of State Board of Nursing includes your Board of Nursing in the 50 states, the District of Columbia, and the 4 U.S. territories, which are Guam, Virgin Islands, American Samoa, and the Northern Mariana Islands. This also offers a number of services that support members of the Board of Nursing, and is also responsible for developing the licensure and assessment exams mentioned earlier. So if anybody later on, after they graduate from our nursing program, want to get on the National Council of State Boards of Nursing, you could be an active member in developing the questions for NCLEX. So I think that would be really very exciting to do. The National Council of State Board of Nursing also offers continuing education opportunities, and they also serve as an important source of data and research about nursing practice. And so very, very important group or body of personnel that really do uphold the standards of our nursing profession. The Nurse Licensure Compact of Nurse Licensure allows a nurse to have a single license that confers the privilege to practice in other states that are part of the Nurse Licensure Compact. And what that means is, say for instance, if you wanted to be a traveling nurse, you must obtain a licensure in every state that you're going to work in as a professional nurse. But you don't have to retake the exam. You can just apply for that licensure in that particular state. So monitoring the nurse's license and taking any needed disciplinary actions are the responsibility of the state that issues that license. It is similar to a driver's license model as well. And then there's also credentialing, where you might have a nursing license which gives you the authority to practice as a professional nurse. But there's also credentialing, which is a formal identification of professionals who meet predetermined standards of professional skill or competence. And we might use the other term for credentialing as certification. And many nurses get other certifications after they graduate and get their nursing license. We as educators can take the CNE, which is a certification for nursing educators. And then there's certification for nurses who might work primarily in a med-surg area. There's credentialing or certifications for nurses who work in critical care areas. So there's all kinds of specific types of credentialing, which really shows that the person is efficient or proficient in that particular area of nursing in which they perform. Okay, so let's talk about you as the nursing student. I think this is an important aspect that has to do with the legal ramifications as a nursing student when you're practicing at the bedside with your patients. Each Nurse Practice Act addresses the duties and responsibilities of nursing students in that state. And typically that includes language that allows nursing students the privilege to practice nursing without a license while engaged in the clinical practicum of an improved nursing education program under the supervision of a qualified instructor. And according to the Ohio Board of Nursing, an instructor must obviously have a current licensure. And remember, we renew those our nursing license every 2 years. I think it costs $45 to renew, or is it $65? I'm sorry, I can't remember. And then you're also required to have 24 CEs, 24 hours of continuing education as well. And the good thing about that is if you happen to be back in school, going for your BSN or getting an advanced practice degree or even a doctorate degree, all those credits will apply to CEs. Okay, so that really makes it very nice. But it's very easy to get 24 CEs in 2 years. And then you just pay your fee and make sure that you have renewed that before the particular date. And usually it's, I don't know, I think they changed it. It used to be in August. I think they made it earlier. And if I'm not mistaken, it's on the odd years. So that's how we renew our licensure. But remember, even though you're under the supervision and direction of a nursing instructor, you also have an ultimate responsibility that you have to be accountable for your actions as well. That includes the obligation to answer for anything that you do and repair any injury one may have caused for their own actions. And these are some of the guidelines that the Board of Nursing provides for our students. You're responsible and obligated to provide safe nursing care, understand program and facility policies and procedures before undertaking any clinical assignment, and demonstrate knowledge about the patient's condition, interventions, medications, and treatments. And perform care only to the highest level of nursing knowledge. If you are unprepared for a clinical assignment, inform your instructor and seek help before beginning a procedure about which you are unsure. If the instructor is not readily available, allow the staff nurse to perform the intervention. You should not be supervised by the staffing of the hospital or facility. It should be done under the supervision of your clinical instructor. And nursing students are held accountable to the same standard of care as licensed nurses. Nursing faculty members are held accountable for appropriate assignment and supervision of students. So if you're out in the clinical area and you've been checked off on intramuscular injections and you've never done one on your own with a real patient, and you are awaiting your instructor to come in and supervise that skill with you, and you're becoming impatient because the instructor is with another student, and you go ahead and do it and harm the patient because you didn't want to wait for the instructor, but you say, oh, I've been checked off, and some harm comes to the patient, you are responsible, not your instructor, because she gave you orders and rules and policies in which you will do procedures only when the instructor is present. And a lot of facilities are requiring now that all faculty must be present when students are administering medications. We want to cut down on the med errors, and you are not allowed to administer medications under the supervision of the staff nurse, but only under the supervision of your clinical instructor. So we have kind of narrowed those rules down so that we can be sure that the student is practicing in the safest manner possible. So that's a little bit about that. And now I want to talk somewhat about advance directives. All right. What is a advance directive? Now, this is some of the legalities, and many times this information is established from our patients, maybe when they're coming in to have pre-labs done before maybe a surgery or procedure or whatever. A healthcare advance directive, and sometimes we refer to that as an AD, is a legal document that's executed by an individual that expresses that individual's desire regarding medical treatment that may be used if and when the individual is no longer able to communicate or make that decision about what he wants done. So this right to use advance directive is guaranteed in your Patient's Self-Determination Act. And the Patient Self-Determination Act is a federal law requiring healthcare institutions that receive federal funding to do the following. At the time the patient is admitted, give patients a written summary of healthcare decision-making rights, the facility's policy with respect to recognizing advance directives, and ask the patient whether or not they have an advance directive, and a document that the advance directive exists in the medical record. And it's up to the patient to provide a copy to put in the patient's chart, educate staff and community about advance directives, and ensure that the individuals know that the facility never discriminates on the basis of whether or not the individual has an advance directive. And a competent patient may execute an advance directive at any time. Remember, they are formal written documents that typically outline the patient's desires regarding the following. So say, for instance, a patient has a stroke. You would hope that that patient would have advance directives, so you will be kind of led as to what kind of care this patient wants to receive. So if he would code, do we resuscitate him? Or other specifics about his resuscitation. So some of the desires would be about the use or withholding of hydration, or even total parental nutrition. Really, a lot of it is about resuscitation or intubation in the event of a life-threatening emergency. We might see the do not resuscitate or do not intubate orders. And then the individual with the authority to make decisions on the patient's behalf in the event the patient isn't able to do so. He's usually referred to as the healthcare surrogate. So maybe you put someone in charge to make those decisions for you in case you're not able to. Types of advance directives include what we call a living will and the durable power of attorney for healthcare. So what is a living will? A living will provides special instructions about what medical treatment the patient chooses to admit or refuse. So say, for instance, they don't want to ever be put on a ventilator. And this is done when the patient themselves is unable to make such decisions about their care. And through the durable power of attorney for healthcare, the patient may designate another individual, and usually it's a family member. It could be the wife, the husband, maybe the oldest child, or a significant other, or a close personal friend, as a healthcare surrogate or a healthcare proxy, and give that individual the power to make those healthcare decisions if the patient isn't able to do so. And these may be combined into a single document or maybe two separate documents. So that's what we mean by a living will and a durable power of attorney for healthcare. Very important to have. So what are the elements of an advance directive? A broadly drafted advance directive usually gives an agent or a surrogate decisions making the authority to do the following. They can consent or refuse any medical treatment or a diagnostic procedure relating to the individual's physical or mental health. And that would be something like nutrition, or maybe putting in a feeding tube. Maybe the person, obviously, if they're comatose, they can't eat on their own. You could also make a decision to hire or discharge people that are taking care of that individual, and maybe authorize admission to medical and long-term care facilities. So you might say, hey, there's nothing more we can do for this person. I want to order that he gets sent to a long-term care facility, and that we just provide him comfort and palliative treatment. Consent to measures for comfort care and pain relief, and have access to all their medical records, and take whatever measures are necessary to carry out, which is including granting releases or waivers to medical facilities and seeking judicial remedies if problems arise. So that's what may be put in advance directive. So what's your role as the nurse? And we know many times as nurses we come across making difficult decisions about a patient. Patients and families often have difficulty making advanced treatment decisions, and the nurse should reassure them that if they make a decision and they have an advance directive, they can actually later on have the capacity to change their mind. Maybe 2 weeks ago they were not a code, but now this week they've thought it over, they're doing better than they thought, and they said, I want to remove that no code. I want to be resuscitated if something should happen. So, and the example your book gives is the patient may have decided not to have ventilator support in the case of a terminal illness, but when the situation occurs, the patient has the right to change his or her mind and to take more time to make that decision. And many times when the patient cannot make the decisions, a healthcare surrogate has been chosen for that particular patient. It's important, too, that you're aware of the specific orders that physicians may write concerning the type of care we are to give the patients when it comes to more of emergency type situations that occur. What are we going to do for this patient, and how far will we extend those services to the patient? You may have heard some of the terms DNR, which means do not resuscitate. So if a patient would have a cardiopulmonary arrest, we would not do CPR on that patient. We can get more specific and say do not intubate. Maybe the patient, we might do CPR on them, but we wouldn't intubate them, okay, because they do not want to be on some type of mechanical ventilation. Or we might see AND, which stands for allow natural death, and we see that in a lot with our patients with terminal diseases. We're just trying to make them comfortable. Cancer, some of your end-stage respiratory diseases, your end-stage neuromuscular diseases, and of course CMO is comfort measures only, okay, making sure that the patients are clean, they're getting, they're positioned well, they're comfortable. We're giving them pain medications. We also may feed them as well, because obviously being fed and not experiencing hunger is keeping the patient very comfortable as well. So those are some very specific types of orders that you may see, and it's the physician or a healthcare provider that writes those. But that's by the authority of the patient or the surrogate who's left in charge to make the decisions for the patient. I knew my dad, and he would never have wanted to be put on a ventilator, so we're going to write do not intubate. My mother would never want anybody pounding on her chest. She's, lived a long life. She's 87 years old. She's very frail. I don't want to see that happen to her. I want her to die with dignity, so we're going to write, do not resuscitate. So these are things that you may hear your patients' families express, especially when the patient is no longer able to express that, or sometimes they are. Sometimes they're very conscious and they know that, it is getting near the end of their life. They're not trying to make it happen quicker, but they're being realistic of what their chances of how long they're going to live. So these are kinds of things that families, patients make, and many times it's important when a particular person is diagnosed with a certain disease that they plan for their future. So if I'm ever hospitalized, this is what I want done for myself. All right, so very important to know, okay? And lastly, I wanted to talk about this last section that deals with the concept of accountability. Sometimes we see accountability and responsibility used interchangeably, but really they're not the same thing. They do have some important distinctions between the two words, and what do those really mean, especially within the healthcare system. And accountability involves being answerable for the outcomes of a task or assignment. Obviously, we as nurses are definitely accountable for our own actions and behaviors, but we may also be accountable for the actions of others, such as persons that are working with us, such as your PCNAs or maybe an LPN. We may not be able to administer the direct care to a patient, but we're still accountable as the nurse in charge that that patient is getting that care. Responsibility is the specific obligation associated with the performance of duties of a particular role, and it belongs to the individual performing the duties. The PCNA is responsible for getting blood pressures and doing AccuChecks, and you're accountable to be sure that that is being done by the PCNA. Do you see the difference? Okay. Accountability in nursing cannot be achieved without clear definition of what is an expected standard of care. And these standards of care are standards of practice, and these are our professional standards and guidelines used to determine what a nurse should or should not do. These standards are established by organizations such as the Joint Commission, American Nurses Association, and the National League for Nursing. They describe the responsibilities for which nurses are accountable, thereby setting a desirable and achievable benchmark against which the performance and care standards of individual nurses may be measured. So, just wanted to be sure that you understood the difference between those two words. There are some components of accountability. So nursing as a profession does promote personal and professional accountability. Aspects of the profession that promote accountability may be to successfully complete specialized training to acquire the body of knowledge necessary for performance of this role. The direction of the professional individual towards service, whether in a community or in an organizational capacity, an allegiance to a code of ethics, the autonomy of the role, and membership in a professional organization. And what does autonomy mean? It means independence or freedom. Thus, a profession is autonomous if it is able to regulate itself and set standards of practice for its own members. There are some things that do influence nursing practice and accountability. Many things do influence nursing as a profession, and because of the integral part nursing plays in the healthcare system, these factors do influence the entire healthcare system. Okay. First is economics, especially when it has to do with insurances, either public or private. Medicare is one aspect of that that's definitely affected, how much nurses are in demand. Consumer demand. A consumer is any person or group that uses a service or commodity. Science and technology. Advances in science and technology greatly affect nursing practice. They affect competence, and they definitely affect accountability. And the more we see change with technology, that truly affects a nurse's clinical training, because we as nurses have to keep up with current practices and equipment, and we are constantly a lifelong learner, where we're having to understand how this equipment works, or policies change, or the technology or the care or the treatment of that particular situation changes. Information availability and telecommunications, because we have access immediately to the internet, has dramatically affected healthcare, particularly as more patients become well informed about their health concerns. I mean, nowadays you can look anything up on the internet. Not that it's always the truth, but we have easy access to information that we never had before. All right. And legislation. Changes in health legislation affect not just the nursing profession, but also the consumer. All right. The Patient Self-Determination Act, for example, requires that all competent adults be informed in writing upon admission to a healthcare institution about their rights to accept or refuse medical care and to use advance directives. So we're making that known to our patients when they first come in, and I think that's great. And of course, we know now there is a current nursing shortage. It involves multiple new factors that did not contribute to previous nursing shortages. Fewer nurses are entering the workforce now, and certain areas are experiencing more acute nursing shortages. Healthcare systems, policymakers, nursing education, and professional organizations must work together to fix the nursing shortage problem. Some recommended actions to address the problem with nursing shortage is giving nursing students the means to enter and progress through educational programs more rapidly and efficiently. I mean, that's why the associate degree program came into being. This was back in the 60s when we needed more nurses, so we established a 2-year program to get students through their program quicker. Stepping up efforts to recruit young people early in the course of their education, even in high school, saying, hey, let's get you into nursing. Providing greater scheduling flexibility, better rewards for experienced nurses who serve as mentors, and more adequate staffing, and increase their salaries, and increase funding for nursing education. It's expensive to go to school. You all know that, and as you continue to go and advance your education, going for a bachelor's, master's, and even a doctorate, it's an incredibly expensive situation when you're advancing your nursing knowledge. So what are we doing to help with the cost of that to keep people in the nursing profession? And we know that we're also short of nursing educators. This is not a field that everybody wants to go into because obviously the pay is not the highest, and it's a lot of responsibility and a lot of work. It's just like a school teacher. You may teach throughout the day, but there's a lot of extra outside work that needs to be done, and people do not want to assume that responsibility. So I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about accountability and responsibility as well, and just to go over some of the highlights from your reading. And now what we'll do is we'll work on some activities as well. So thank you for your attention, and we'll begin those shortly.